أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وارزقنا فهم النبيين وحفظ المرسلين اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الكرام ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Alhamdulillah. Give me one moment. I'll take Naam, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to a special session for this month. And we chose to do something along the lines of philosophy. And this is basically just an introduction to philosophy. What is philosophy? What is philosophy in Islam? And what is its importance, if there is an importance? Because it's one of the most debated subjects of study in our tradition from the time of its introduction to our tradition as a formal science. But it should be noted that as far as Islam is concerned, philosophy, it's not something that was novel even to Muslims, even at the time of the companions. And I'm going to make a distinction here between what is commonly understood as falsafa and what is understood as hikmah. Philosophy in English, the word English, comes from the Greek philosophia, which is Sophia is wisdom, and philo, which is love. So it's basically the love of wisdom, and that's what the equivalence in Arabic would be. If you want to do a literal translation, it will be something like hubb al-hikmah or just hikmah. And if you look at certain philosophers, they prefer to use the term hikmah instead of falsafa, unless they were actually discussing the formal components of philosophy. So there is such a thing as philosophy as a science. And then there is such a thing as philosophy in general. So everybody philosophizes. That's like a fundamental rule. Everyone philosophizes because every human being, like Aristotle, for example, said when he starts off his book on metaphysics, his opening line on that is, all men by their nature desire to know. And he goes by that principle. That premise is the rest of everything he discusses is based on that principle, that all men by their nature desire to know, meaning they desire to want to understand. And that's the final pursuit of philosophy as a science, as a subject, that what it wants to arrive at, its aim is understanding. So philosophy becomes this umbrella in which there are all these different topics and problems that philosophers try to work out, they try to solve in terms of understanding. And it's all based on questions, right? Philosophers probe query into, they have this kind of, they wonder what their assumption of reality would be, and then they test that assumption using reason. It's not based on empirical proof as much as it is based off of reason. So Socrates said that this wondering, all philosophy begins at this wondering and no place else. It begins in this wonder. I wonder what this is. I wonder what that is. I wonder what we're doing here. I wonder, what my purpose is. This wondering is like a probe into reality. And that's what philosophy is trying to really aim at arriving. So that all human beings, we would say, philosophize. But then there's good philosophy and there's bad philosophy, and then there's just what you would say deficient philosophy. So the Ammiya, the common man, it's more like hit and miss for them. If they are experienced in life, like they've reached that age of wisdom, like you could call somebody a sheikh, for example, not that they are a scholar, but then they are an elderly senior individual who's gone through life, who's experienced life. They will have a philosophy to give you about life, because it's through their constant trial and error and their understanding of what life is for them that they will be able to offer you some wisdom that you can apply for your own self. But then there are others who, the larger portion now of humankind, they don't have much experience and they don't have knowledge either that can assist them in terms of them actually being able to philosophize properly. So their philosophy comes out hit and miss. Sometimes they're right, sometimes, many times they're wrong, because they don't actually have the tools that philosophers employ to really refine their thought and come to these profound understandings. And then there are bad philosophers. So those are deficient philosophers, the larger majority of mankind. And then there are bad philosophers. Bad philosophers are the kinds of people who they object to philosophy by using philosophy. And part of that category also includes those kinds of philosophers who have got an intent behind their philosophy. They've got an agenda or a motive behind their philosophy. So they'll come up with convoluted ideas that sound good, that sound reasonable. They almost sound profound, but they don't really have any benefits to draw from it. There's no goodness in it to draw from. A lot of atheistic, secularistic, worldly based philosophy typically falls in that category as well. And then along in that category, you will also find those people who refute against philosophy, but they have never studied it. They've never studied it. They've never understood what it is, what its methods are, what its uses are, what its importance is. They've never really given it much thought. They just negate it. They just reject it outright. It's like somebody whom you argue with, and you start pointing out their fallacies in logic, and then they tell you, no, don't use logic because it doesn't work in their favor. So they'll say the same thing about philosophy. No, this doesn't apply here. We don't want philosophies here. And then you've got good philosophers. Good philosophers are individuals who do the proper study. They know the methods, they know the tools, they know where the application of it also lies. They know how to apply the philosophy that they have studied. Because bad philosophers will typically, even though bad philosophers may study the science properly, they may study the methods properly, but they just don't know how to apply it. You see, you might be encountering a pragmatic issue in life, but then instead of dealing with that pragmatic issue, they're here giving you these profound statements and aphorisms instead. You see, those are bad philosophers. They're doing philosophy for the sake of it. It's like if you're having a legal issue, for example, like somebody got arrested and now they're dealing with the cops and the police station, and they're doing all those formalities, and that moment, the circumstance necessitates that you need to deal with the issue. You don't start coming up with, ethics and, so-and-so said like this. And, if you come up with all these aphorisms about, if there are any bad practices or such things, that's not the moment for philosophy. That's what I'm trying. Those are bad philosophers. Good philosophers understand that not only have they studied the science and they have followed the methods properly, and they acknowledge where they themselves might be lacking. Good philosophers will also know where to apply philosophy for the betterment or for the benefit of it. The best philosophers are those who acknowledge that the light of reason, which is the primary tool of philosophy, must never supersede or act without the light of revelation. Those are the best philosophers. Those are the philosophers who acknowledge that the knowledge of mankind is by itself is deficient, in that we can probe wonderment and inquiry into reality as much as we want, but at the end of the day, we must always remember that the light of revelation will sit in judgment over anything that we might derive or deduce ourselves. So the fundamental aim of philosophy throughout, whether it's good philosophy, bad philosophy, or deficient philosophy, the fundamental aim of it is to seek understanding. It is just to seek understanding. It's just to understand what is all this about. Why am I here? What is the nature of things? In essence, you could say that, I mean, if you look at bad philosophers will not really probe those elements as much. They will acknowledge it up until human reason has its limit, because you can't actually go further. You can't go further into the unknown, into the beyond, until revelation throws light upon it, until revelation tells you what it is. So much of philosophy, as is derived in Islam, it actually comes from the Quran. It does not come from the philosophers. Bad philosophers will apply philosophy only to worldly necessities. And hence what they do is, their fundamental error is, they look at life as a problem. And then they try to solve what they would then term as the problem of life. And so they end up straying from the fundamental aim of philosophy, which is to understand, not to solve problems. So they're no longer aiming to try and understand life. What is the purpose? Why am I here? Why all this? What is all this about? What is this reality about? Where did it come from? They're not trying to understand that. What they're trying to do is to figure out, how do we solve it? Okay, death is an issue. How do we solve that? You see, limited resources, how do we solve that? War and conflict, how do we solve that? Racism, how do we solve it? Governance, democracy, capitalism, economics has its own philosophy. So capitalism is one of those philosophies. Religion is a problem. They see religion as a problem in the world. They see, oh, so-and-so group has this belief and so-and-so group has that belief. How do we solve that? Rather than understand what it is its nature, what is its origin? Why is it like this? Why do we have Christians? Why do we have Muslims? It goes much deeper than simply a rational derivation of it, to see it in its rational senses. But like I said, everyone will do philosophy, because one of the fundamental tools of philosophy is logic, and everyone does logic. It's foundational to the human being. It's part of your nature. It's your fitrah. Allah has equipped each and every human being with an intellect, and the usage of that intellect is logical. Now, whether it's good logic or bad logic, that's where the difference will lie. But everyone applies logic. So likewise, whether it's good philosophy or bad philosophy, everyone applies or does philosophy. But here is where we will make that distinction now. Like we said, because one thing is very interesting. If you ask any philosopher, what is philosophy? They can never give you a straight answer. I mean, I can't give you a straight answer to that. Like if you were to define philosophy, I have to give you all this was its definition, what I just gave you. It's difficult to define what is philosophy, because everyone does it, and we all come from different denominations and backgrounds and cultures and religions, and we all have a certain understanding of the world. And philosophy really, ultimately what it produces is a worldview. because it's through philosophy that we understand the world. And so we have a certain understanding of the world. There is that individual who understands the world as the creation of God. And so we are servants of God. There's that kind of individual. And then there's another kind of individual whose worldview is, oh, it's just all cause and effect. There is no God, you see? So they all have their different perspectives. So each one will hence have their own sort of definition of what philosophy is to them. If you look at, there's some niche categories of philosophies. For example, somebody will, what's your business philosophy, for example? You know, people will say that, what's your business philosophy? What's your corporate philosophy? What's your political philosophy? You see, these are like subcategories, and each one will have their own definition of it. And likewise, you hear things like Islamic philosophy, for example. What is Islamic philosophy? First of all, that term Islamic applied anywhere is it's just a contextual frame. It doesn't actually have any meaning. It doesn't have any real meaning. It's just a contextual framework that sort of distinguishes what the Muslims produce and what essentially the rest of the world produces. In reality, there's no such thing as Islamic philosophy. There's no such thing as Islamic psychology. It's like looking for Islamic physics or Islamic biology or Islamic, well, I mean, they've got like Islamic finance and Islamic economics and Islamic this, that, and the other. But in reality, when you look at it as a philosopher, there's no such thing as Islamic philosophy. It's just philosophy. And the early philosophers of the Muslim tradition, they didn't have a specific term. If you look in their books, in their texts, they don't have Islamic philosophy. They just call it philosophy. That they knew that what they were doing was just philosophy. It was just the Muslims' contribution to that science. In much the same way that a Muslim could contribute to physics or could contribute to economics or law or politics or any other field of study, they saw it as they were just doing falsafa. That's philosophy. But they made a distinction between falsafa and hikmah. Because what comes in the prophetic tradition from revelation, that cannot be called philosophy. So the Quran is not a book of philosophy. It's not a book of logic, neither is it a book of any particular science. The Quran gives you hikmah, and it is from that hikmah that we understand reality. It becomes the foundation. It becomes, because that's now Ummul Kitab, like that's the foundational book. It does not give you philosophical arguments. It gives you direct statements. It tells you this is what it is. Now, you can debate that if you want to. So philosophers will look at some of the statements and start having different arguments based off of, okay, is it like this, is it like that? And they'll use different tools for that, rhetorical tools, logical tools, epistemological instruments, and all those others to try and come up with, okay, is it like this or is it like that? You see, that's part of logic. The is it this or is it that? That's usually, it is performed in the second operation of the mind. If you remember when we did our course on logic, you have the naive perception, the conception of something, which is the tasawwur, and then you have the tasdiq, which is the conviction of it or the judgment of it. Is it this, is it that? It's not this, therefore it's that, right? Then you've got the syllogistic reasoning, what's called qiyas. And so that's where you've got now the arguments that flow from that. So the Muslims, they didn't look at this in terms of, they understood that there is such a thing as falsafa. And that falsafa, its methods, that's what it includes. That falsafa, which when you see falsafa, when you see philosophy, there's philosophy as falsafa and there's philosophy as hikmah. The falsafa philosophy, that's where you'll find all the different methodologies and the different arguments, and some arguments that are solid arguments that become foundational in and of themselves, right? That then produce other lines of thought and lines of inquiry. But that's what it all includes. And then it includes all its various kind of subjects. So you've got logic, you've got metaphysics, you've got even physics falls under that. I mean, it's no longer studied, but it used to be studied under philosophy. It was a branch of philosophy. So the early philosophers, they actually studied physics as an extension of philosophy. So Ibn Sina, for example, has got a book, Admonitions and Remarks. That's essentially his book on physics, and he explains the natural world. Aristotle's the same thing. And I mean, Ibn Sina is really Aristotelian in that sense. So he kind of, because he studied Aristotelian philosophy. But they made that distinction between falsafa and hikmah, because the falsafa portion, that's your subject now. That's the subject of study. So you say, I'm studying philosophy. You're not just reading the books of philosophy, because people often do that. They'll say things like, I'm studying philosophy. I just finished reading Plato, and I just finished reading Nietzsche, or I finished reading so and so. What? No, you're just reading the books of the philosophers. The actual study of philosophy, that's different. You do need to read those and study those books as well, but the actual study involves the various branches of like the subjects that will enable you to do philosophy. So doing philosophy and reading philosophy are also two different things. It's like you can read a science textbook, but actually doing the experiments, that's a different thing altogether. And coming up with theories and doing the calculations, that's different. You need those tools to help you actually read those books, because you won't understand them. And this is where our scholars now, they started introducing the refutations against the philosophers, because it was the common naive individual who would go to the book market, pick up a book on philosophy and start reading, and does not have the tools to make the distinction to say, this argument has this, and this issue, and therefore not put an entire, his whole conviction on that, or to say, this has been refuted by this, and this, and this, to determine the truth value of it. You need those tools. You need tools like logic. You need tools like epistemology. You need tools like having studied language itself, because philosophy is inseparable from language. Philosophy has to do with human thought. If your language is deficient, your philosophy will be deficient. And much of philosophy, when you look at the books, they've got all these complex terms, because again, it uses logic. And so terms and definitions are part of it. A lot of the books that are written by the philosophers, they have an assumption. They write those books with an assumption, and the assumption being that you have at least studied what are known in our sciences as ulum al-ala, the instrumental sciences, logic and grammar and rhetoric, these type of sciences, aqidah, basic fiqh. You have these sciences with which you can determine the truth value of what you're reading. Otherwise, yes, it will lead you astray. Almost 100% of the time, people end up going astray by reading books of philosophy, and they're not trained to do so. They're not trained in that. And that makes us, there is a distinction between how a philosopher writes his books, because there are some books that they do write intentionally for the common man. And then there are other books that are written for philosophers, in which they have their complex arguments, their sophisticated arguments. So, I mean, this is just an introduction. We could actually go in much, much detail on all this. But what I want to do is I want to read from a book on philosophy that's written by an amazing philosopher of our age. But it's written for the common man. And it's something that I think should be read by Muslims. Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas, he was a Malaysian. He passed away this Ramadan. May Allah have mercy on him. I corresponded with him a few times on some of because I had a lot of questions about his book. And the book I have here is the Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam. It's an amazing book that he wrote. I mean, he wrote this in 1994. It's just, if you can get this book, do invest in it. If you've never read philosophical works, this might be a bit tricky for you, but and you might need to sort of read a couple of times, 2-3 times over. He doesn't use short sentences. He's a very prolific writer. He's got long flowing sentences. Sometimes there's like a few paragraphs in here that are a half page long. That's actually a whole sentence. There's no full stop in it. So, it can be a bit, it can give you a headache. But this is an amazing book that he's written. What he did was, he sort of put together in this book as a sort of an introduction to philosophy for the beginner. And he's got 8 chapters in there, 7 chapters, 8 chapters with this preface, which is not that long, in which he explains the basic fundamentals of what you need to know in order to have at least a conceptual understanding of philosophy, so that you do not get swayed or deceived by the dominant philosophies in the world. And this is something that Muslims, I think, have failed to understand, that is staring them right in the face. The world as it stands today, and as it has undergone its transformation since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, this world does not belong to us. We don't have a say in this world. From 1924. From 1919, you would say, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated, but from 1924, when the state of Turkey was founded and the caliphate, as it was called, was completely abolished. There is no Muslim governance. From that point onwards, we don't have a say in anything, any field. Education, economics, finance, medicine, whatever it might be, politics, governance, state affairs, military, foreign policy, doesn't matter, you name it, whatever it might be. If you come to the table for discussion on a serious level, not on Facebook, if you come to the table, you're not coming as a Muslim. You're coming as an individual. Your religion does not apply there. Whichever state you're representing, that's what you're coming as. If you're a Turkish Muslim, you're not coming as a Turkish Muslim, you're coming as a Turk. If you're a Saudi Muslim, you're not coming as a Saudi Arabian Muslim, you're coming as a Saudi. That idea, that nationalism that has taken over the world from that point onwards, that in itself is a philosophy, nationalism. It's a political philosophy. This is, at present, we don't have philosophy. And this is what has made us in a most vulnerable position. So the idea that when people come up and say things, nonsensical things like, we don't need philosophy, we don't need logic, this is haram, this is haram, this is haram, those people are very stupid, very, very stupid. I don't care if you've got if you're a sheikh or you're Maulana, Mufti, whichever one you may be, whichever university you've graduated from. I don't care. You feel insulted. When you make a statement like that, that's a very idiotic thing to say, because it shows that you don't know, you are completely disassociated from reality. The reality that is in front of us today, that person is completely disassociated from reality, because there is no way that you can combat the state of the world today, which itself is driven by philosophy. We don't have time to go through all of these different philosophies that have brought Western civilization to the mark that they are at today, but it is driven by philosophy. And the idea that, oh, we don't need philosophy. Okay, then that's fine then. Go and argue with them using Aqidah. Go and tell them, we have to believe in the 6 pillars. Bring those arguments on the table. Try and resolve what's going on in the world, in the Middle East today. So go and liberate Gaza with your Aqidah. Failure to recognizing that this is what we're dealing with, as what has brought us to this state. And this is why my emphasis on this is that I mean, and even going back to the early philosophers, like Imam al-Ghazali, for example, he's not really considered a philosopher, but I think he's a philosopher, and there are many who acknowledge him as such. He studied philosophy up until his point in time, over the duration of 2 years. He writes in his autobiography, it took him 2 years in his part-time, in his free time. He studied and he mastered philosophy in his free time over the duration of 2 years. We're talking dominant philosophies at that time. All the philosophies that are available in the Muslim world, including individuals like Ibn Sina and Al-Kindi and those who superseded Imam al-Ghazali. And then also non-Muslim philosophers going back in tradition, those books that were translated into Arabic, works like Aristotle and Plato, and such works. He studied that in 2 years, and then he wrote a book titled Maqasid al-Falasifa, the objectives of the philosopher. What are they trying to do? Why are they doing this? Why are they going into this field of study? Because there were already by his time a lot of refutations and objections at that time from the scholars in that same argument that it leads people astray. And it does lead people astray, but it's leading Muslims astray even today. Even today, without us realizing it, it's leading us astray because we are leeching off those philosophies, those convoluted, sacrilegious, godless philosophies. It's right there in front of us in everything. That these lights and these cameras in front of me and the furniture that's in my space here, this is all coming from that philosophy. It's that worldview. It's their worldview. That's what's produced this. So we are bearers of that philosophy. If you're not cautious about it, it will lead you astray. I'm using rudimentary examples, but this applies everywhere, because if you're going to school, if you're going to work, you're working in a certain company, you're going to the bank to do your transactions, even the money that you're using, the cash money that you're using, or the credit cards that you use. Every single system in the world as it stands today is a child of that secular philosophy. It's coming, the overall umbrella is secularism as a philosophy. It is that philosophy that is detached, separated from revelation and religion. It is called secularism. And it is a philosophy that is based on pure rationality. Pure rationality. But pure rationality has a problem, because it might make logical sense, does not necessarily make it true when you now factor in the other and the beyond, other than what we can plainly see around us. So even at the current state and the current position, for those who argue, no, it's haram, it leads people astray, it's haram, it leads people astray. Buddy, you're already being led astray. You just don't know it. If you were to study it, maybe you would at least see how it's leading you astray. But without studying it, if you just keep calling it haram and pay no attention to it, it's leading you astray. You have no idea. You see? I mean, you go to a restaurant, you're diligent about finding out whether the food there is halal or not. If you're not diligent, if you don't know how to do that, to figure that out, it's not just a simple matter of asking the owner or the cook or whatever, but knowing which ingredients are used how. Even in terms of things like cooking oil, for example, knowing that's the method. That's the philosophical. You need to know, and then you will be able to avoid the haram. If you don't know and you just assume, oh, they don't sell this, they don't sell pork, so it should be okay, and then you end up leading yourself astray. Well, same thing applies in terms of the state of the world today. Because if you don't know where this ideology is coming from, the device that's in your hand, what ideology spawned that device? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, and that's a universal hikmah. That's not a philosophy, that's a hikmah that he's imparted unto us. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. And from that, entire philosophy can be written. every action is contingent only on the intention, which means anything that you see manifest in the physical world, its origination is in that noumenal world, that world of thought. Somebody thought it out. Somebody sat there, worked it out to build this, and then to build that, and then to take it to the next stage, and then to refine it, and then to advance it, and to do all that. Somebody actually did that. Where did that come from? That person who was thinking that out, who was trying to figure out how to build this thing, where did that thought come from? Did it come from revelation? Or it came from science? Where did the science come from? Yeah, it came from science. I know the science behind it. I know the physics behind it. Okay, where did that come from? Because we stopped doing science as far as Muslims are concerned. By 14th century, we were no longer scientists. We were just regurgitating the theories before. It's the Western world that took it up and they advanced it forward. That's why they are now the dominant power. So we stopped doing science. We can't even say that it came from the Muslims. And this is part of also our own, idiotic nature of saying, oh, the camera, Ibn Haytham, optics, you see, oh, so-and-so, we originated it. Yeah, we originated it in theory. In theory, yes. But we stopped. We didn't do anything further than that. So it's nice to think about it, wishful thinking, but wishful thinking is not going to get us out of the hot soup we are in today. But regardless, that science that has spawned the devices around us, that has spawned the systems that are around us, that even though they have their outward, because they're just objects, they're there. They're objects. They'll serve. They have their benefits. They have their disadvantages. That's the nature of this world. Everything that's part of this world has got two sides. It's a matter of just weighing the benefits against the harm. And that's how we make judgments, you see? So the object is not the one to blame. It is the final act. That act originated from somewhere. That's what you need to now think about. But you need to understand how that thing was conceived in its original conception. What philosophy spawned that? And where has that philosophy, where did it originate and how did it reach this point? These are important things. And that's why it needs to be studied. Not by everyone. I'm not saying every Muslim should now start studying philosophy. But like Imam al-Ghazali, he considered it to be at least a fard kifaya. That some individuals in the ummah do need to study it just so that we can have a defense for it. And so that's when he wrote Maqasid al-Falasifa. What he wanted to show there was, that this is the method of the philosophers. And it's a very useful and beneficial method. And you can apply it in your own life. And when he wrote that, at that time, it was like a simple book on philosophy that the common man could access. And the ulama actually chastised him for that. You're making it too accessible for people, for the common man. Whereas other scholars, they actually praised him. Abu Hamid is becoming philosopher nowadays. But then he actually dealt a heavy blow on both sides of those who are praising him and those who are chastising him. He wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa. And Tahafut al-Falasifa was now the refutation of the philosophers, the incoherencies. He said, these are the faults. I told you what the good things are, but these are the issues. And in those issues, he showed where the philosophers were actually going astray. And what issues, and this is where now the Western world likes also to criticize and say, well, it was Al-Ghazali who destroyed philosophy in Islam, you see. But he didn't. He actually gave Islam a way forward for philosophy, how philosophy could actually be beneficial. And that's what has spawned generation after generation of philosophers after that who are good philosophers, and some of them are the best philosophers. When you look at some of the scholars who have been produced in our tradition, you look at individuals like Ibn Khaldun, for example, in both his political philosophy, his economic philosophy, his civilizational philosophy, and the social science becoming, that he produced from that. It's just amazing. Just by reading his Muqaddimah, it's just phenomenal. And in that, he says, as his own premise, he says that you cannot study history without studying philosophy. You can't. Any historian, he argues, any historian who studies history without studying philosophy is just giving you the facts. If he tries to interpret them, don't trust that interpretation. Because the philosophy is what resulted in the events that we saw in history. If we look at World War II, for example, we can look at the facts. Yeah, Hitler did this, and then Britain did this, and then Churchill did this, and then so-and-so did like that, and then so-and-so. We can look at the facts. They all did, everyone did something. Because it was war that involved humans, and human beings were the ones who were doing it. So that's the event. But understanding the ideology that drove that event is more important than understanding the events themselves. The events are just there. They're open. They're out in the open world. Understanding why Hitler did what he did to result in what happened. And why those people counter-opposed what he did. The philosophy behind it, that's more important. We look at other philosophers in history like Sidi Zarruq, for example, who was an incredible metaphysician. And his book, Qawaid al-Tasawwuf, it's really a philosophical and logical treatise on the science of Tasawwuf. He gives you rational perspectives and rational methodologies in Tasawwuf. And say, if you want to do Tasawwuf, this is how you do it because this and this and this and because this and these are the principles. And you need to know how to do it like this. You don't just go into a state, you know, and this is where like Mutasawwifa, those who pretend to be Sufi, those are usually the category of bad philosophers because they haven't studied it, but they try to be philosophical and mystical and it leads them astray. And then you've got the contemporary philosophers of our age. Well, I mean, the early age, you've got individuals like Muhammad Iqbal in Pakistan. You've got individuals like Dr. Fazlur Rahman Ansari. You've got many other individuals. And then coming down to now, Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, a truly phenomenal individual and truly a loss for this ummah as a philosopher. So what I want to do is I want to read just the opening page of his preface without going too much into the details. And just to give you what he's trying to achieve and why this is something that is important. He says in this preface, he says, the conception and conceptualization of knowledge and the sciences, as well as the adaptation of methods and theories, are in each civilization formulated within the framework of its own metaphysical system, forming its worldview. Whichever culture, whichever group it might be, it will not develop all the sciences itself. That's one point. It will adapt from other sources. It will draw from other denominations as well. This applies regardless. The Muslims took from the Greeks, the Indians, the Chinese. The Persians took from the Romans and the Greeks. The Indians took from the Chinese. Coming down even to Western civilization, much of Europe took from the Muslims. And even at the present state of the world, we, the Muslims, are taking from the West. And there's nothing wrong with that. We can develop it ourselves, but much of it has been developed in the West, so we can take that. But it's important to understand what he's saying is that each one is formulated within its own metaphysical framework that forms its worldview. Each civilization that produces these knowledges in the sciences develops them, produces them based on its own metaphysical understanding or understanding of the nature of the world and the worldview that is produced from that. So when you're taking from the West, you have to understand that that science was developed by them in a certain framework of how they see the world. At one point, it was driven by Christian virtue. And then at a certain point, it changed from Christian virtues to Christian values because they wanted to eliminate the idea of sin. so that they could introduce the idea of legalities and illegalities. That's a different philosophy altogether. And now that Christian value also is no longer there. So you have to keep in mind that when the science is being developed, it's developed in that framework of that group's understanding of the world. And their understanding of the world is what determines what they want to do with the world. I'm talking here in this case, let me spell it out. I'm talking about artificial intelligence. I'm talking about AI that has been developed, has been in development since computer science began. I mean, we're going back all the way to the times of World War II, when really the first computers of encryption or decryption were sort of introduced, and the science really developed from that point onwards to reach its peak and everything. But now we are talking about, but there's a transformation. If you examine that Western world, it has a transformation. There's a paradigm shift that has taken place from that time to what it is today. And so when it is developing this, it is developing this thing from its own framework of how it understands reality and how it wants to cultivate what it wants to produce from that reality. Now, remember, I did say that philosophy and language are inseparable. The more efficient your language, it can be expected to have a more efficient philosophy, or you will be able to do philosophy better. If it's deficient, philosophy will definitely be deficient. But the equation for that is that language will develop the thought. The thought will develop the philosophy will produce the worldview, and the worldview will be the premise upon which you will cultivate your reality, hence producing the civilization as a product. So civilization, Western civilization, goes back in that line of contingency to its worldview, to its philosophies, and to its thought and the language that it has been fed with. I'm not talking about the formal structure of the language. I'm not about English or Urdu or French or German. I'm talking about that. I'm talking about the language cluster. What sort of language are they using? If you look at a man, if you've had a man from the 1950s speak and a man from 2026 speak, same age, same probably education, let's say they both have PhDs in the same science. But if you look at this man, the way he speaks, and you look at this man, the way he speaks, there's a big contrast. There's a big contrast in their language, in the way of their speech, the words that they use, the way they articulate them, the way they form them, the sentences, the way they put the words together, and what produced the thought that's produced out of that. There's a big contrast between the two. I'm talking about that language. He's got the same understanding in there. So he says here, each metaphysical system, and thus also the worldview it projects, is not the same for every civilization. It differs from one another in accordance with differences in the interpretation of what is taken to be ultimately true and real. If knowledge and the sciences that grow from it are not aligned to the statements and general conclusions of revealed truth, if the knowledge is not aligned to revelation, then what is taken to be true may not always be truly so, nor what is taken to be real be really so. And such interpretation must therefore undergo recurrent corrective revision, necessitating what is called paradigm shifts, which involve also changes in the worldview and the metaphysical system that projects it. If you look at Western civilization, it began with a language cluster that was Christian. It was imbibed with religion. Not Islam per se or approved by Islam in that regard, but it had a religious basis. And so it projected a worldview according to that. But with each deficient marker in it, meaning each time that they tried to achieve something out of this reality that was not agreeing to revelation, they underwent processes of refinement and changing. These are the paradigm shifts and this is where you then see, when you look at it in terms of in a historical lens, you see these ages, right? You've got the medieval age, and then you've got the Renaissance, then you've got the Enlightenment, and you've got science and reason, then you have industrial age. After the industrial age, now you've got the technological age, now you've got the artificial age, artificial intelligence. So with each stage, there's a refinement and paradigm shift that's taking place. Because what they're trying to achieve from that does not align to reveal truth. And the closer they get to their aim, their goal, the much less it would be aligned to revealed truth. Hence, what it essentially produces at the end is not true, or is not truly so as he says it. And it's not really so, as he says. It looks real, it's realistic, but it's not real. You see, and this is the age that is producing that false reality. It looks true, but it's not true. It looks real, but it's not real. We do not agree with those who take the position that reality and truth and the values derived from them are separate. We don't separate the two. Reality and truth must be corresponding to each other. This is one of the premises that we used in logic. And we say that whatever your reason comes up with, it must agree with reality. It has to have mutabaqa. It should be haqiqat se mutabiq. What you have in terms of your understanding must have its corresponding reality in the world. If you look at a cup, at a glass, and you call it, if I have a glass of water here, that's the reality of it, and I call this a mug of coffee, and I convince myself that no, it is a mug of coffee, then my thought, my logic, hence my philosophy there, is not corresponding. It's not reality. Now, the philosophy dominant in academics today wants to separate the two. This is where you've got things like subjectivity. You know, truth is different for everyone now. Your truth, my truth, everybody's truth. We just sit and debate. The one majority will win. That's how they want to do things. But everybody has their own view. You know, everyone has their own perspective, including children now. They want to bring children into the same, category. Let children choose and decide which one they want. They want to be boy or girl. Let them choose, because their truth is the real truth. No, it's not. Their truth is not the real truth. Mutabiq is something else. The reality is something else. You're a male, you want to be a female because you feel like it. No, that doesn't work. It's not reality. You've got these things. You've got like moral relativism, for example, is another philosophy. What I think is right and what you think is right are equally valid, even though they're different things. I think it's right for me to do this. You think it's not right for me to do that. Well, you have your opinion, I have my opinion. It doesn't work like that. But that's the world that these people want to produce. So we reject that. We do not agree with those who take the position that reality and truth and the values derived from them are separate, and that they articulate their meanings within the paradigms of relativity and plurality having equal validity. We don't agree with that. Since we maintain that knowledge is not entirely a property of human mind, this is a premise in as far as the Muslim thought is concerned, this is a fundamental axiom. This does not change. There's no argument there. That knowledge is not entirely a property of the human mind, and that the sciences derived from it are not the product solely of unaided human reason and sense experience, possessing an objectivity that preclude value judgment. But that knowledge and the sciences need guidance and verification from the statements and general conclusions of revealed truth. Anything that you come out as a final conclusion of a theory, of an understanding, of whatever it might be, I'm speaking in terms of academics, it must undergo guidance. It must be guided by and be scrutinized by revealed truth, by revelation. It is incumbent upon scholars and the learned among us who are entrusted to teach and to educate, to acquaint themselves with a clear understanding of the metaphysics of Islam. They have to study philosophy. If you're going to teach, if you're going to try and educate people, if you're going to try and awaken them to the reality or help them navigate the reality. I mean, all these people, all these scholars who want to give advice, you see, they want to give counseling because they're a scholar now, apparently. They want to give advice. They want to tell you how to raise your children. This is how you should raise your children because apparently they're experts. But they've got no understanding of the reality that's out there. What are the things that are shaping your teenagers' minds when they're going to school and the company that they're keeping? What are the things that are shaping your children's minds to the television programs that they're exposed to and the YouTube channels and the Instagrams and the TikToks and all those things? Where are those coming from? Do you know? Do you understand them? Are you able to see the kufr in it? How will you do that? How will you see that? If you don't know what Islam itself presents to you as far as that inner reality is concerned, the metaphysical reality, you won't get to metaphysics in Islam without philosophy. It's philosophy that enables it. That's the science that studies it. That's the science that enables you to understand the fundamental nature of spirituality. It is incumbent upon scholars and the learned amongst us who are entrusted to teach and to educate, to acquaint themselves with a clear understanding of the metaphysics of Islam and of the permanently established constituent elements of the worldview derived from it. The fundamental axioms of what Islam says, that this is reality, this is how it should be. What does the Quran say about this is what reality should be? When the Quran is saying, don't commit fasad in the world, what does it mean? What is the fundamental reality? How are we supposed to protect this place? How are we supposed to shape it and guide it? That knowledge, how would be imparted to our children? Because this is the reality of Gog and Magog now. That Western civilization that we are referring to is the reality of Gog and Magog, who are defined in the Quran as a people whose fundamental philosophy is fasad, it's corruption. Corruption of what? It's not just polluting the air and polluting the sea. No, it's corruption of everything, the corruption of the natural order, corruption of the law that Allah has put forth, corruption of law itself. Look at one of the things that they did in terms of corrupting themselves first before they spread that corruption outwards. Whenever you hear now any discourse from the West, you will always hear about Western values. And this term, values, is also being adapted now in Muslim countries without them realizing what it is that they're actually adapting, which is exactly what Sayyid Naqib is talking about. You don't know what you're adapting. You haven't actually understood it. Why is it called values? Why isn't it called virtue anymore? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, this is what he's saying. What does the revealed knowledge say about the fundamental reality of the world? About the fundamental reality of not just the human being, but the world as a whole. But about the human being in this context. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَفْسِ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. He has proportioned the soul and he has inspired it with vice and virtue. He has inspired it with fujur, vice, which is sin. That's where you get sin from. And taqwa, and virtue. So these two things are inseparable in the human being as concepts. If you speak about virtue, you automatically speak about its antonym, which is vice. And if you speak about vice, you automatically speak about its antonymic form, virtue. Now, if your objective was to get rid of sin, because that's the issue there. The issue here is not the virtue, the issue is the sin. Because the sin is the prohibition. The prohibition tells you, don't overindulge, don't engage in this act, don't do this, don't do that. The childish nature does not like, don't do this. The childish nature wants to do it. If that's what they want to achieve, to establish a world whereabouts you could do whatever you wanted to do, right? That's one of the key philosophies that guides Western civilization. Do what thou wilt. It comes from the same satanic sources. I think it comes from Aleister Crowley, who was a sorcerer. He was a magician, but his ideas are deeply embedded in Western culture. Do what thou will. Do whatever you want to do. The idea of moral relativism. If you feel like it's a good thing, then it's a good thing. If you don't feel like it's a good thing, like if I stab somebody, according to their understanding, if I stab somebody and I don't think it's a bad thing to do, then that's fine. According to that same idea, this is what that ideology presents: moral relativism. The idea that there's no real evil here. It's just decision. It's just whatever is decided in that outward circumstance, the outward judgment of it. If that's your objective, then you need to get rid of the idea of vice. You need to get rid of the idea of sin. How do you do that? The only way to do that is if you take out its counterpart. You have to get rid of virtue, and by doing so, you automatically get rid of the concept of vice, of the concept of sin. The idea that a human being, when he does something wrong, he doesn't just look at it as he's broken the law, in terms of, okay, now he's going to jail, or there's a fine to pay, or something like that. No, he sees it as a moral vice. I did something wrong, as a moral impediment on himself. But if you get rid of the virtue, you automatically get rid of the vice, the sin. And so it is no longer a matter of a religious judgment in terms of morality. It's no longer a matter of that. We're no longer talking about virtue. Well, what do you replace it with then? You replace it with values. Why values? Because a value can be positive or negative. It's just a number at the end of the day. It's a quantitative attribution. It can be a positive thing, it can be a negative thing. We can just determine it based on that. Is it legal or illegal? You see, so in the present world today, and especially in the Western world now, a man who engages in sexual activity with another man is no longer an immoral act. It's not about morality anymore because you got rid of it. It's all about whether or not the law allows you, the law of the land. Is it legal or illegal? And the same is true even when you go to the Muslim world. If you go to the UAE, for example, United Arab Emirates, we are Muslim. It's not classified as immorality. It is classified as illegal activity. And you'll be fined for that. But they say, no, we are Muslim. We uphold the Sharia. No, you're not upholding Sharia. You're upholding your own national law. That when your parliament goes, they can vote on it. And they can get rid of it. Just as the way they did it over there, they can do it over here. Because once you remove it from its religious affiliation, whereby God is the one who determines whether this is legal or illegal, once you remove that, well, now you can decide yourself. That's why it's no longer classified as virtue. Now it is values. This is what I'm just expanding on this, but if you read the book, he actually goes into a lot more details there. This is because that metaphysics is not only established upon reason and experience of Islam, as reflected in the intellectual and religious tradition of Islam, that's what he said, but also upon the articulation of the revealed religion itself about the nature of reality and of truth in verification of the revelation. The metaphysics that Islam produces is not just something that the Muslims have experienced themselves of it in terms of their religious practice, that feeling, that engagement. the idea of iman in the heart, the idea of trust, the idea of faith, and the way that is applied in the real world. It is also articulated by revelation. And this, in this way, he's saying that the philosophy that produces them is going to be good philosophy. And if it is applied where it is required to produce benefit, then it becomes the best philosophy. And the one who applies it becomes the best philosopher. Alhamdulillah, I think we are crossed our time. So I'm going to stop here without going into too many details to end up confusing people in technical terms and concepts and all that. But I hope that this will give provoke some thought in people and maybe encourage them to. You don't have to study it, and if you do want to study it, I would suggest you do it properly. Don't do it by yourself, because it will lead you astray. It will definitely lead you astray, because there are a lot of arguments that are logically sound. Meaning what? Meaning they tick all the boxes of logic. So it might seem like true to you, because the logic will appeal directly to your mind. And oh, he says like this, therefore this, it makes sense. Well, just because it makes sense does not necessarily make it true, you see? So you might read some of those books, but then if you don't have a teacher to help you, guide you through that, it will definitely lead you astray, and people have gone astray. So be careful. You don't need to study it as a formal subject, but you do need to at least engage in the philosophical tradition that Muslims have produced. And books like these, like Said Naqib al-Attas, books by other scholars. I have a few here with me on my shelf. I have here The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam by Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. I have the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun that's been translated. I have The History and Philosophy of Islamic Science by Osman Bakar. He was actually, I think he was a student of Dr. Naqib, but he's an amazing scholar, and he's compiled this book as well. I have here The Anatomy of Knowledge. Yeah, this is by Dr. Karim. The Anatomy of Knowledge and the Ontological Necessity of First Principles. This is by Dr. Karim Laham. He's the one who actually gave me the title of Sidi. For some reason, because I studied with him, and for some reason, he just started calling me Sidi AbuBilaal in class along with the other students. It's kind of awkward because we were calling each other. I was calling him Sidi Laham, and he's calling me. Anyway, he's an amazing scholar in philosophy as well. So this is a good book. It's a bit complicated though, but it's a good book. It's very short, and I think you can get it. You can get the PDF online for free. It's published by Tabah Research. You can look it up and find it online. You can get the PDF for free. The books even they were published and distributed for free. And some of the essays in there are written by his own students. So it's really interesting to see what the work they're doing. Aside from that, what I do have here is Ibn Sina's Admonitions and Remarks, but that's very complex. That's actually now a text on philosophy for philosophers and scientists. I didn't bring any of my other books with me, but I would recommend these books. And if you do want to start off with, the Prolegomena is a very good starting point. So inshallah, let's take a quick break and maybe resume after maybe 5 minutes for questions and answers. Jazakumullah khair. Alhamdulillah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Let's start, inshallah.
So there's a question in the chat, which is, did you say the aim of philosophy is to understand life?
The aim of philosophy is to gain understanding. Is to understand. That's the aim of philosophy. It's to understand whatever it might be. overall it would be life itself, as in we human beings. We are the ones who are trying to understand why we are here and what we are doing here. But its aim is overall to understand. And so what philosophy tries to do is it tries to go through different lines of reasoning and probing of inquiry and questions that target the questions themselves. And then to arrive at certain axioms that would provide you with an understanding, which can be used axiomatically or aphoristically or some such. But the aim of philosophy, the fundamental aim of it, is to reach understanding, is to get to ma'rifah. And that's what we would call wisdom now. The product of that is hikmah. And then you can apply that hikmah. No.
Yes, Sister Zeba, you may please ask your questions.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, dear Ustad AbuBilaal, and assalamu alaikum everybody. So, my question is regarding the current age we live in, with the secularization of knowledge and the sciences. So the sciences today in the institutions of education, the curriculum it's got a huge issue. Do you think that to change this curriculum, it requires it requires us to change the issue of the philosophy, of the scientific philosophy at the grassroots level, and not just focus on decolonizing the curriculum? Does it require a change in its and question? Does it require questioning the current scientific philosophy of the sciences? For example, it seems that it's predominantly it's the framework is under like evolutionary philosophy and Darwinism and a nihilistic perspective. It underpins our current modern day education system. And I have heard a lot of criticisms to do regarding Socrates and Aristotle. And do you think that perhaps the current the sciences today, the problem with the science today come from Socrates, come from the issue with Socrates and Aristotle? I have heard that Nietzsche is very he doesn't like Socrates. He says, he has a lot of criticism there with the Greek philosophers and their obsession. And Muhammad Iqbal has also mentioned the obsession of Aristotelian philosophy with man, and not man and its link with nature and like nature and the divine cosmology. So I think these are my questions.
Okay. Yeah. So okay. As far as sciences are concerned, yeah, I think that to address the issue, we have to go to the roots, to the grassroots of it. The idea of decolonizing science and then making it work for us I don't think that's it's not a fruitful endeavor. I think Muhammad Iqbal also argued on the idea of the Islamicization of knowledge. And he made these arguments and said, yes, there are beneficial aspects of it that are useful, and we do use them, whether it's in medicine or any other field. But the idea of just converting it is really pointless, because the root of it itself needs to be addressed. one of the things that science has had in the past, things like physics, for example. I mean, I mentioned physics because I've studied that. It was always studied with the assumption, because it always begins with an assumption. Science, by the way, is presented as having only two axioms. That's observation and then experimentation to prove the observation correct or not. So you hypothesize, I wonder what happens if we do this, and then you experiment, you produce your results, you prove the hypothesis true. But it actually has a third axiom, which is the first axiom that comes before the observation and experimentation, and that's the assumption. The assumptions are what determine how the hypothesis will be done. And this is one of the arguments that Ibn Taymiyyah made against logic, and said that as far as the logic is concerned, yeah, it's got its uses, but one thing that the logicians is what he was refuting, and the conclusions they were arriving at, he said that one thing that the logicians always forget is that there are assumptions to every logical train of thought. There's always an assumption that precedes it. So the logic might be sound, but if the assumption is false, the conclusion is going to be false as well. So the assumptions here are the ones that really are the issue, and the assumptions are at the root cause of it. So in the past, the assumption of studying any natural science, for example, the assumption was always that God is the one who has created the human form. God is the one who has created the world. God is the one who has put this system in place. That was the assumption. And so that guided the science forward. That assumption has been replaced now. So you've got the evolutionary system now. You see, that's the assumption that's replaced the science. And so now whatever is produced out of that goes based on that assumption. And that's the issue. You can't just convert that. You can't just change its constituents. The very foundation needs to be changed. So yes, we do need to go to the grassroots levels. And the counter argument to that will be made is, well, we'd be trying to reinvent the wheel in this case, trying to reinvent our own sciences, but not necessarily. We can still take the sciences that have been developed by others than us, but change the fundamental foundations of it, the assumptions of it, and then restructure the science back again. And it'll produce incredible results. So, yeah, I believe that it has to be addressed at that grassroots level. There's a book by Dr. Naqib also that he has written, Islam and Secularism. I think that's one book. And I think the Islamization of knowledge was written by him as well. I'm not sure, I'll have to look that up, but he wrote something on that particular concept of the sciences and knowledge itself. And this argument, which is a contemporary argument, and it needs to be given its due as to what do we do, how do we receive these sciences? Because these are the things that now we need to adapt to as far as the world is concerned. It's the thing that the common man is dealing with. See, if he wants to build a better life for himself, he has to get that secular education so that he can get that secular qualification so that he can qualify for that secular job. How do you deal with that problem? How do you solve that problem? So once again, it's brought into, because now we have to try and solve the problem because we don't actually study the philosophies behind it and the philosophical method itself in order to address the issue. Sorry, what was your second question?
It was regarding Aristotle and Socrates.
Yes.
And the current, assumption, and then basing reality and truth based on that assumption. Does it come from, perhaps is there an influence of Aristotelian and Greek philosophy in this?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. There is an influence of Greek philosophy in both the Muslim tradition as well as the Western tradition. In fact, much of that influence that is on the Western tradition comes through the Muslim tradition, because at a certain point, the Western world could not grasp the meanings of that Greek philosophy. Much of it was lost to them. it is thanks to the Muslims and their interpretation of it, which then got translated and was brought back into Latin from Greek, coming into Persian, then or from Greek and into Arabic, and then taken back into the Western world. It's actually the Muslim philosophers that unlocked those old philosophies. Like it was actually Ibn Sina is usually regarded in that. Avicenna is what the West calls him. And Ibn Sina was not able to understand Aristotle. He said, I read that book. I read Aristotle's works so many times over. I memorized it word for word, but I still couldn't understand what he was talking about. And until one day he was in the market, in the book market. They actually had book markets back then. You'd be hard pressed to find a bookshop these days. They had entire markets that were just for books. So he said, I was in the book market one day, and in the corner of like a whole pile, somewhere sitting in the corner there, not even on the front shelf and display, it was this old, it was tattered book, worn out, and I picked that up, and it was a commentary on Aristotle, written by Al-Farabi. He said, as soon as I read that, it all came to me. I got it. I understood Aristotle. And so he then started writing. And so Ibn Sina's philosophy has been attributed to be Aristotelian. Now, the way this differs is, you have to understand, first of all, Socrates was kind of Plato's teacher. Not in the formal sense. They didn't have a formal school system with the classes and everything like that. It was in that traditional sense whereby, the young just followed the older one and then observed and learned from the older one by being in their presence and asking questions whenever they had a chance. So Plato was basically observing what Socrates was doing, and he was recording this. So if you look at Plato's works, each book in there is basically a dialogue that he records in his earlier segments. He records these dialogues that he sees Socrates having with different individuals on these different philosophical concepts and how Socrates arrives at his conclusions. Aristotle was Plato's student after Plato had established like an academy. So it's known as Plato's Academy, and Aristotle studied under him. And here you'll find something interesting, is that Plato does not entirely agree with Socrates. He appreciates Socrates' thought and his methodology and much of the conclusions that he arrives at, but he doesn't wholesomely agree with it. He also introduces his own understandings. Aristotle also does not wholly agree with Plato. In fact, both their philosophical worldview differs almost fundamentally. That's why you've got this Platonic thought and you've got Aristotelian thought. Aristotle was more of he had more of a systematic approach, whereas Plato was more fluid. He was more dynamic in his thought, whereas Aristotle was more structured, and he was able to also develop something like the science of logic. That Aristotelian thought is more appreciated in the world today than Plato, because Plato's focus was more on things like virtue and ethics and morality and these type of things, whereas Aristotle was more leaning towards the natural world and interpretation of the natural world, and then things like rhetoric and its usage in speech as well as in literature, in logic, and these type of things. So much of the world tends to apply or lean heavily towards Aristotelian philosophy. And then throughout the history, I'm trying to shorten this almost 2,500 year history into, but you'll find many philosophers will have their own critiques about these early philosophers. So each had their own, Imam al-Ghazali has his own critique towards that Aristotelian thought. Imam al-Ghazali was more Platonic in that sense. You could categorize him in that way. He leaned more towards that dynamic aspect rather than a more rigid and rigorous study of it. if you look at Ibn Rushd, he leans more towards Aristotelian than Platonic. So he actually wrote a refutation of Imam al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, which he titled Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherency of the incoherency. Because Imam al-Ghazali's text was titled The Incoherency of the Philosophers, and he wrote The Incoherency of the Incoherency. So philosophers will always do this. And that's why you need like a guided approach to understand why so-and-so is having this outlook. Nietzsche was a very interesting individual in his philosophy. He wasn't entirely religiously inclined. And in fact, he was largely a skeptic of religion. And that's more to do with what he saw becoming of the Christian world that made him turn away from Christianity and religion as a whole. He saw it as an abuse. If you read his book titled The Antichrist, he actually wrote a book on the Dajjal, the Antichrist, in which he makes his famous statement, God is dead, which people attributed that, oh, he's being atheistic or nihilistic. But that statement, philosophers tend to talk this way, you see, in metaphoric senses. So you have to also understand how the language of the philosopher works. What he really means is that, and this was interpreted as God is dead and we killed him, meaning we removed him from our lives. And he had a heavy critique on Christianity. Now, Christianity adopted Aristotelian logic and Aristotelian thought. Christianity, for large part, adopted that Aristotelian philosophy. And so his critique is going towards that also. He critiqued everything from the Crusades to and in fact, he's the one who coined the term Judeo-Christian. He's the Judeo-Christian, the term that we use today, is coined by Nietzsche. He coined it as Judenchristen or Christlich, something like that in German. He had a heavy critique of that, and he saw it for what it was. They wanted to establish this secular way of life, and so the idea of them removing or eradicating religion entirely, that was his approach to it. But then he was also a very miserable person, because just because others don't follow the religion properly doesn't mean you shouldn't follow it either. It's not their fault that you're not following religion. Likewise, it shouldn't be your fault that they're not following religion, or shouldn't be religious fault for nobody following it. If they're not following religion, or if they're making or turning it into a nominalistic thing, then you can still seek out the normative aspect of it. And what's also interesting about Nietzsche was that he made good remarks towards Islam. It was just amazing. I don't know what was going on in that man's mind, but he critiqued Judaism and critiqued Christianity, but overall had very nice things to say about Islam, but then never became Muslim himself. So there's an example of, a man who studied philosophy. It was a good philosopher, but bad in his application, and ended up going astray. Did I answer you on both the questions?
Yes, Ustad. Jazakallahu khairan. But could you just expand a little bit more on the application of the philosophy and in this example as well?
Oh, that's a heavy question. I come up with a practical example, for example. Okay, so I'll give you a very rudimentary example, right? When life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. That's a philosophy, right? That's a philosophy. It's rudimentary. It's not profound per se, but it's something that we can exchange with each other, or we can apply it in our own sense to say, when if you end up encountering a bad circumstance in your life, or if you have any trouble or any such thing, try to make the best of it, or try your best to solve it, or try your best to turn it into something. In other words, make the effort. Right? So make lemonade out of it. Don't just chew on the sour lemon and be bitter about it and complain about it the whole time. Use it to produce something better out of that. So that's a philosophy, and that's the application of it. There are profound such philosophies in Islam, right back from the Sahaba and throughout all. And if you look at the text that we did of Ibn Ata'illah, the Hikam, that's the Hikam. Those are full of hikmahs, you know, and each one can be applied if you understand the core philosophy behind it. Does that make sense? Or
Yes, Alhamdulillah.
okay.
There's a question in the chat, which is what would be coming after the artificial age?
After the artificial age, that's the last age. There's nothing after that. To go deeper into it, the artificial age is what produces that which mankind is going to submit to as other than God. And this is like agreed upon by all philosophers. The artificial age is us producing that instrument that will surpass us in both artificiality of thought, in terms of intelligence, that's why they're calling it intelligence, as well as its ability to act, or the things that it will be able to do. And one of the axioms that is applied in philosophy is that any being of lesser intelligence will always submit to a being of higher intelligence than itself. So when man recognizes God as a superior intelligence than himself, then man submits to God. Now, when man is producing an intelligence with the clear aim of taking it to a point whereby it will surpass human intelligence, albeit presenting it as if it is a natural transformation, like it's an inevitability, like we can't help ourselves, we just have to do it. No one can pull the plug. It has to reach that end. We're doing it deliberately. Ergo, we're manufacturing the intelligence to which we will submit to. And that in itself results in our destruction. I'm not even speaking from the perspective of Islam. I'm just speaking in general terms, without invoking prophecy, without speaking about the eschatologies. I'm talking about it as it is right now in the world. You want to ask anyone who has examined those matters, and there's no one who is serious enough can say good things about it in terms of its eventuality. Einstein said that a mouse will never make a mousetrap, but the human being has made the the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb. In other words, he was trying to say, look at how stupid we are. We're making the tools of our own destruction. He also said on that note, I don't know how World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. In comparison to that, being that the devastation resulting from World War III will be so immense that we'll be left with nothing but sticks and stones. If at all we are going to fight a war after that, it's going to be with sticks and stones. So this progression that we are reaching, and we're really on the cusp of it. We're not talking about decades. We're talking about a few years, a very few, 2, 3, 5 years. I mean, there's a limit to how much you can actually stretch an anticipation. Wallahu a'lam when it is going to happen. I don't like getting into predictive modes, but in terms of foresight on that, it's a very, near future. But what it's going to produce, the resultant of it is going to result in such devastation that we are actually going to be now on that final cusp of it. What comes after that is is nothing. It's everything is done. Human civilization is done at that point. Then we're just waiting for the hour to manifest. Now we would bring in the eschatological element of it, that the hour to manifest, the actual hour, the finality of all creation would manifest at that point. But as it stands right now, with everything, the limit at which it has reached now, and the extension of that, the pushing of those boundaries, the deliberate push towards it. And again, it rests in human hands. We are the ones who are doing it, and how badly we want to achieve it will determine how soon it will manifest. This is why, I mean, giving it a predictive timeline is very difficult. How fast they can progress in manifesting it could be a few short years, but it is going to reach. I don't want to get into this melancholy state and put everyone down, but the reality is what the reality is. The more we, and as far as we are concerned, even if we are not the ones developing all this, the destruction upon us is already evident, and it's going to get worse and worse. The more we engage, the more we indulge, and the more we justify ourselves that we're not really doing the wrong thing, that it's fine, that it's not going to touch me, that I'm going to be okay. To bring in that prophetic element into it, the Prophet ﷺ said that, the fitna of Dajjal, there is no single house that it is not going to enter. He said that every single human being, man and woman and child of my ummah, will be slapped by that fitna. There is no single individual who will escape from it. He said, even the one with the most forbearance, the one with the greatest patience and endurance and a lot of knowledge, he's going to be hayran, he's going to be disturbed. He's going to go like, oh my, never expected this. So the idea that, somehow we're going to be safe, somehow we're going to get away with it. No, every single individual is going to face that tribulation. And there are no words to emphasize how heavy, how terrible that tribulation is going to be. There were times that the Sahaba mentioned that there were times when he would speak, Rasulullah would speak about those tribulations, and he would go red in the face, or he would start trembling, like his hands would start trembling, because he had been given knowledge of it, the foresight of that. He saw what would become of his ummah. We don't know. We don't know what he knows. We haven't seen what he has seen or has been shown by Allah of what's going to become of us. A lot of us are in states of delusion. But if we sit down to really think about it, it's going to give you nightmares. I mean, I know there are times when I've really been, shaken up by it. When I look at the progression of it and how far it's going to reach. So subhanAllah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all. But the way things are, I know we've reached that point whereby even the analysts themselves, those who analyze, those who study the science of artificial intelligence, those who study, who do military analytics, those who are in political theory, even within their own framework, they'll all be stating the same universal conclusion, that we've reached a point of no return. The effects that are now in they cannot be reversed. We can't go back to the 60s or the 70s. We can't go back to the point whereby we were still manageable. We could still manage whatever we were producing in terms of craft and technology and weaponry and all these things. We've reached the event horizon, to use terms in astrophysics. You have a black hole, and it's got a point in its dead center, what's called the singularity, and it's the densest, most heaviest point that pulls everything in once, and then outside that blackness of it, it's not a hole per se. It's so black that even light cannot escape from that singular point. So you can't really see anything there. It's like blackness. So it's called a black hole. But on its outer peripheral, where there are still items that are not fully drawn in, they're sort of being pulled into an orbit into the singularity, that you will see this ring of light. You can still see some things out there, and that ring is called the event horizon. I say once you reach the event horizon, you can't pull back. Now you are inevitably drawn towards the center. There's no escape from it. And so the common understanding among all these frameworks is that we have reached an event horizon as far as the human civilization is concerned. Whether you approach it from religion or you approach it from finance or economics or politics or military or technology, whichever framework you approach it at, you will see that humanity has reached an event horizon. And so we are now inevitably into an accelerated mode, because at that point of the event horizon, now everything accelerates, everything grows exponential. Time itself, which is very interesting, that in the event horizon, time itself loses all shape and form. And this is another remarkable prophecy. The Prophet ﷺ said that towards this end, time will seem to be moving faster and faster. That a year will feel like a month, and a month like a week, and a week like a day, and a day like an hour, and an hour like a kindling of a fire. And if you look, and when we're talking about events as they are transpiring, it's just one event after another event after another. Next thing you know, 1 week has passed. It's just amazing. So the way we're seeing things happening, it's just amazing. Anyway, I'm going off on a different train of thought, but I hope I answered your question. Yeah, we're not really looking at anything after this age per se. We're looking at the finality of human civilization. This is the end. This is the last age of human civilization. Is there anyone else?
Ustad, yes, there are 3 more questions.
Mhm.
And the first one is, what is the difference between quiddity and essence? How do we define metaphysics?
Sorry, come again. The difference between?
Quiddity and essence.
Quiddity and essence. Okay, so quiddity, there's not much difference between the two. Essence is essentially quiddity. Quiddity is the act of understanding the essence or grasping the essence of it. So quiddity is a Latin term. The Arabic equivalence of that is mahiyatun. The mahiyatun is actually it's just a contraction. It's a terminization of 2 words, which is mahiya. What is it? And that's quiddity, which comes from the Latin quides, which is to say, what is it? And it's the formal inquiry, the first inquiry of the mind in terms of grasping or knowing something. The what is the probe, and the it is the target of the probe. So what is it is the first question that the mind asks, whether verbally or it does it intuitively. In general, we always do things intuitively. As we're looking around us, we are always asking that first question, what is it? What is it? And we're grasping the essence of of the thing, which would also be called the itness of it. It's itness. So if this is the object here, I can't put this object in my head to know what it is, but I can grasp its essence in terms of what is it. It is a glass of water. So now I understand its essence as a glass of water. That's one definition of essence. But if you look in other frameworks, for example, maybe in psychology, for example, the essence of a thing, if you examine it as far as the psychology is concerned, the essence would be like the soul, for example. That the soul is the essence of the body. So you have the body and you have the essence. And in logic, the scholars differentiate it and say that all of reality is made in this sense. There are essences, and then there are accidents or effects of those essences. So there are jawahir, which is the essence, and then there are a'rad, which are the accidents. So the body is the accident of the soul. The body was created for the soul. Understand? So the soul came before the body. The soul existed in the pre-worldly place of existence where we come from, that divine presence. And then when the time had been appropriated for us to enter into this world, each individual, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fashioned the body for that soul. For each individual, the body's been fashioned. Once the body has started taking form in the womb, then the soul is breathed into it. So the soul is the accident of the essence within it. So when I'm speaking to you, I'm not speaking to your body. I'm speaking to the essence within it. If I want to understand someone, I ask, what is your name? Because your name is attributed to your essence. So in order for me to grasp your essence in terms of who you are, I need to know your name. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And what was the other question? There was another question to that.
How do we define metaphysics?
Metaphysics. Metaphysics is two words, actually. It's meta and physics. And the meta comes from the Greek. It means other than physics. So meta is other than physics or physicality. So the body is part of the physical world. And the metaphysics of the body pertain to those elements that are not part of the physical composition. So in the metaphysics of the body, for example, in psychology, we would be talking about the soul and the mind and the emotions and the spirit, the ruh, and the thoughts. Those are all metaphysical entities. So that's metaphysics is to do with other than the physical world. Okay?
So there's another question.
Yeah.
Just ask like, if I am correct, you said that nation have their base philosophy based on their point of views, but also take philosophy from our nations. Is this correct?
No, not nations, but civilizations. Different civilizations have their own natural, cyclical, you would say, development. They will go through their own growth, and then they will reach a point whereby their civilization, as it's expanding, they now start getting into things like culture and technology, right? They'll develop their own infrastructures, they'll develop their own sort of machineries or tools and equipments and these type of things, their own political frameworks, systems of governance, and all these things. So they'll develop all that, and then backing up all that will be the relative sciences that help them figure all that out. And then some civilizations, like when they interact with other civilizations, they'll say, oh, you guys do it like this. Yeah, we would like to learn that. And so, they'll take from that. So like medicine in the early stages of the Muslim civilization was borrowed heavily from the Greeks, and that's why it's called Unani. Unani medicines, or from the Ionians, they were the Greeks, they were called the Ionians. That's Unani medicine. So things like the temperament theory and like the four humors and these type of things, these are all part of Unani, or it was known as Tibba Unani. So we got medicine as a science from the Greeks. We didn't have medicine as a science, as a formal science in our tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't have medicine in our tradition. No, there were certain things that people did when people got sick. There are certain remedies that they employed. But an actual formal science to understand the nature of the disease, to classify it, to classify its various treatments, and then its diagnosis, and these type of things as a formal science, that we got that from the Greeks. Mathematics was also interesting. We got part of it from the Indians. Like the Indian civilization, they developed the number 0. That was not there in Greek arithmetic. So we got it from them. The Western civilization and modern mathematics got a lot from the Muslim civilization. Things like algorithms, algebra, those were developed by the Muslims. So each civilization will have its own sort of development. They'll develop their own sciences. And some of the sciences will be like really at their peak, while others will be lacking. And then other civilizations will have the counterbalance. And this is where now we look at if you want to understand the philosophy behind that, why that is like that, we go to our axioms, which are in the Quran, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, we created you male and female, and we placed you in tribes and nations, shu'uban wa qaba'ila, lita'arafu, that you may understand that you're not just the only ones here, that there are others who have a different way of looking at the world, and you can benefit from that. So the Muslims did not do, what people, the Western civilization tried to turn everything and made it, purely Eurocentric. So their sciences are basically, it comes from Galileo, and it only comes from Newton, and it only comes from, this one, and it's only their scientists who sort of discovered everything we have today. But these sciences have been going and circulating around the world for thousands of years. They moved. The Egyptians developed something of mathematics that was brought into the Greeks. The Greeks developed an arithmetic of their own from those same understandings. Similarly, the Chinese interacted with the Indians, and they developed a kind of medicine between them and sciences between them. The Romans, they didn't have sciences. Much of it was acquired from the different nations that they conquered and brought into the Roman Empire. The Persians, similarly, the sciences of grammar as we have them today, these came from the Muslims. They didn't come from Western civilization. Like, we developed the science of grammar that was then applied in other science. Even Latin, for example, which was a very heavy duty language, even at that time, they didn't have a formal grammar system per se. They had a grammar. It's not that they didn't have grammar, but the way grammar is done as a science, the Muslims developed it. From where? From the Quran. Arabic grammar was developed from the Quran, and the techniques that were used in the development of the science were then applied, and they were borrowed by these other language groups. So this is what I meant, like civilizations will, borrow from each other, but each of them will develop their own sciences based on their framework and their understanding of the world, meaning based on their own philosophy or philosophies and the way they view the world and what they want to do with the world. So the Chinese, they have a certain perspective, they have a view of the world. Now, if you interact with the Chinese, and if you look at, even at present state, for one thing, the Chinese are very proud of their 5,000 plus year history. For another thing, a lot of that 5,000 year history in terms of tradition is still retained in their way of life, in terms of their culture. If you want to understand how the Chinese do their governance, their policies, for example, their economics, their whole, how they run themselves, how they exist, you have to understand the philosophies that the Chinese employ, because it is in that framework that they see the world in a certain way, and then they cultivate it accordingly. So there's actually a saying in that I think one of the foreign ministers of China that made at a conference or something. I don't remember where I heard it, but I remember the saying. It was very interesting. He said that China does not like in China you can change the policies or something like that. what he was referring to is that the policies can be changed, but the principles of governance, those don't change because they're tied or they're rooted deep into the family unit, the idea of family being part of community and then flourishing from community to tribe and tribe into nation and nation into civilization. So their form of governance like that is not something that the way the West does it in terms of, okay, we'll pass a new bill and vote and decide whether we want to do this anymore or not, and then get rid of it. So they have no regard for tradition. But the Chinese, they retain their tradition. So government policies can be changed, but the root tradition of the way that governance is done, that doesn't change. See, so that's the way they see the world, and that's the way they cultivate it. And so in order to understand, and you don't project your own philosophy on them, you have to understand their philosophy and how they perceive it. The West does it the other way around. They project their own philosophy onto the world. And that's why you have all these wars taking place. Because they look at Afghanistan and say, oh, they're women, they're being oppressed. According to you, maybe, but not according to them. That's the way they see the world. That's the way they want it. But according to you, you can't do the world according to you. You're going to create a lot of chaos and confusion and problems and bloodshed and corruption. That's the bad philosopher. That's the Western civilization. That's the bad philosopher. Having studied the methods, but wrong application. I hope that answered the question.
Just one last question in the chat.
Uh-huh.
Could this statement be philosophical? Early to bed, early to rise makes a man strong, healthy, and wise.
It is philosophical, but it's more of an aphorism. It's more of an aphorism than a philosophy per se. The philosophy would be derived from that. In terms of making an argument, for example, what does that mean? Why early to bed? Why early to rise? What if you go to bed early but still rise early? That's what a philosopher would then do. Will look at that and start coming up with arguments to build a philosophy out of that. But the statement itself is an aphorism. It would be the basis of which a philosophy can be born from. An entire way of thinking can arise from that. I'm not negating or saying that it's a bad thing, like that's a useless thing. But the distinction here is that a statement like that, or like what I said about lemons, right? Or any other thing. Proverbs, for example. Every culture has their own proverbs, right? Hari Hari has no blessing. There's a similar one in Swahili, Haraka Haraka Haina Baraka. Every proverb has its own, every culture has its own proverbs, which are aphorisms. But you can take that and you can build a philosophy out of that. An entire way of thinking, an entire way of perceiving the world and interacting with the world from that. So that can become your sort of philosophy. You can apply that to say, I do want to wake up early, go to sleep early and wake up early so I can do so many things with my day. And so that becomes a philosophy in terms of going back to that earlier question about how do you apply that. So in terms of application in the real world now, this is how I want to do it. So now you have a philosophy and it's being applied. That's good philosophy. Yeah.
Okay, Ustad. No questions in the chat. So I think we can end the session for today. If there are no questions from that side, are there any audience?
No questions. No one has asked any questions on this side. Everyone is a philosopher, so there are no questions. Actually, no one is a philosopher because philosophers actually ask questions. If you don't ask questions, you can't call yourself a philosopher.
Ustad, there's one question, which is, so a good philosopher is he who knows his boundaries and understands others' worldview. A
good philosopher is, first of all, one who understands how to philosophize. That's a good philosopher, to understand how to philosophize, how philosophy is done. And yes, by that, it necessitates knowing what are the different methods that are used by different people when they philosophize. How does a certain group of people reach their understanding of the world compared to how does this other group of people? That applies even on the subsistent level, even within your family. Because always remember that everyone philosophizes, which means even within your family, they all have different perspectives, right? How did so-and-so arrive at it? How did so-and-so arrive at it? So a good philosopher recognizes that. A good philosopher is also able to see what others are doing, to see what method, what is he doing here? How did he arrive at this conclusion? Is that howness of how do you arrive at that? That's an epistemological question. What's the epistemology here? How did you start from point A to point B? A good philosopher recognizes that. And a good philosopher never stops asking questions, because philosophy is about thought, and thought is executed by the intellect. And the nature of the intellect, the purpose for which it was designed, was to probe query. It's always asking questions. So the one who is not asking questions, that person needs to reevaluate, and not consider themselves intelligent, because they're not using the intellect. The intellect's usage is to ask questions. Children are the best philosophers because they're always asking questions. And if you look at the nature of their questions, they're asking those heavyweight questions. The fault is on the part of the parents, who will laugh at that. Oh, he's asking such questions. Or dismiss it altogether and not even try to give them a kind of an understanding or something of an answer. Just dismiss it altogether. That is destruction of the child's fitrah. But you want to breed a generation of philosophers, you need to encourage them to ask questions, and you need to try to help them, show them how they can arrive at those answers. Not just give them the answers, show them how they can arrive at those answers. But a good philosopher, even ourselves, we need to ask questions. We need to look at reality and try to probe inquiry into that. People are asking questions, but the wrong kinds of questions. What did so and so say? Did you hear? Did you know? What's the price? Did you know the price went up the other day? Oh my God, I don't know what we're going to do. These type of questions, those are not philosophical questions. We need to dedicate time in our lives to ask the fundamental questions, at least to keep the query open, because it keeps us vigilant. Even if you don't find the answers, keeping the query open and continuously probing inquiry into that keeps the individual awake and alive and vigilant. What is reality? Why are we here? Where did this all come from? And where is it all going to? We need to keep those questions alive. Anyway, I can hear the adhan of Maghrib, so we will have to break here so that we can pray our Maghrib time. If there's no questions, we can end the session for tonight, inshallah.
So I see one last question now,
Okay.
which is, no, actually it's not a question. I think, let me see. Yes, it's a question, yes. Which is, it was interesting to hear how Chinese principles are embedded in policy making, and in contrast, how West does not care about the family unit in their approach. We also do see a trend of Islamic scholars from the West adopting similar principles while giving their fatwas. One scholar went to the extent to say that the joint family system is haram, and we see constant intellectual attacks on traditions and cultures. For example, Muslim youth blaming the culture. Just wanted to know your thoughts on that. Does it show a deficiency in thinking, or is it to appease their audience?
Well, for most of them, it is to appease their audience, because that's really the culture in which they are practicing their religion, right? It is a culture of me, myself, and I. It is a culture of fame and fortune. If you look at a lot of scholars, much of their content, they call it content now, right? They're producing content. And that content is designed for that purpose, to get maximum engagement and that popularity. So much of what they say is always purposed towards that, and it is driven by the philosophy of that culture, the culture that they are imbibed in. That's a clear example of an ignorant philosopher. He's still philosophizing, but it's not his philosophy. He's a mouthpiece for another philosophy, which is a corrupt philosophy. Omar said, تفقهوا قبل أن تفقهوا. Understand before understanding is done for you. أو كما قال, in such a way, the exact morph of it is a bit, it's tricky, but that's a saying, like an aphorism that he said, and from that also comes out another philosophy. The idea that learn to philosophize before someone else philosophizes for you. In other words, if you don't have your own thought, your own principles, your own creed, your own understanding, your own way of seeing the world, then you will be using the worldview of someone else. And that's unfortunately the case with the many contemporary, I'm not going to call them scholars, whatever titles they have. That's the case with a lot of these individuals. They are imbibed in a certain culture. They cannot see past that. Their standard of measure is really their own desire. They are desirous of that way of life. And so their standard of measuring the truth value of that way of life is desire itself. And so they gauge it based on that, and they pass their fatwa in saying that it's the right thing that they're doing. And then once they initiate the assumptions, then that assumption just carries them forward on and on. And so eventually it leads them astray. And so they end up going astray. There are a lot of such scholars, or scholar pretenders. And some of them will even say, I'm not a scholar by any means. I'm just trying to understand. And then they'll spew out a whole bunch of conclusive facts that they have arrived at, when they have got no training whatsoever in the sciences. They've got no basis speaking on those subjects, but they'll do it. A lot of people will now, there are a lot of people I've seen want to go into interpreting the Quran, which is really amazing. It's one of the signs of the age, you could say. They've got no training whatsoever. They can't even recite properly. They have got zero tajweed, nothing. Their pronunciations are all over the place. It's just the whole accent that they come with. That's what comes out. They can't pronounce the words properly. They can't read them properly. They don't know how the inflection in the language works to know where the emphasis rests in any word. And they've got no tafsir, they've got no tajweed, they've got no aqidah, they've got no fiqh, they've got nothing. Like, there's got no grounding whatsoever in the tradition. Forget being a scholar in the tradition, they've got zero grounding, but they want to interpret the Quran. And because they have a large audience, whether it's on Instagram or Facebook or something, or on YouTube, they'll have these lessons that they teach every whatever, and they'll be coming up with different ayat, and now suddenly, they come up with a new perspective and a new interpretation, and all these profound understandings. It's just that's the way the world is now today. But what is their actual driving force? Why are they doing that? It's because that's what the culture dictates of them. Because they don't have any thought of their own, any principles of their own to say, this is false, what we're doing. This world, this consumer mentality. Consumerism is a philosophy. It's a philosophy of the West. And they're proud of it, consumerism, because it feeds capitalism. It makes everybody a winner. You win by buying and consuming, and the other one wins by selling and consuming wealth. According to them, it's a win-win. But it's not a win-win anyway. We don't have time to go into the particulars of it. But they're driven by that mindset. And so what they produce ultimately the worldview, right? If that's the worldview, if the language input is like that, the thought will be like that. And the philosophy will hence be like that, which is not their own philosophy, it's somebody else, because they're using somebody else's language to feed their thoughts. And so they'll see the world in a certain way and they'll cultivate it accordingly. And so that's what they will end up producing. Now, if you want to look at civilization, as far as the Muslim civilization, and ask the question, what happened to the Muslim civilization? Well, you just have to go back in that equation and you'll get your answer. Because civilization goes to culture, which goes to worldview, which goes to philosophy, and it goes to language. We abandoned the language of the Quran and adapted the language of the West and pop culture and all these things. And so that's how our thought was developed, and that's the worldview that we ended up having. And that's the culture that we brought into our way of life. And so hence, this is the civilization, is the product. Anyway, I hope I answered the question. We will have to end the session for tonight because it's Maghrib time for me. So we have to pray our salah here. I don't know if anybody else, it's Maghrib time for you. We can end, inshallah, Adil?
Yes, Jazakallah khairan for the session. Before ending, could you please mention the name of Usman Bakar's book that you mentioned during the session?
Osman Bakar's book is the history. Here, hold it up for you. It's the history and philosophy of Islamic science. That's Osman Bakr. It's a very good book. It's much easier to read. It doesn't have like complicated terminology and concepts. It's easier to read and to grasp and to understand. If you want, I actually put some of my books together. If you do want to go into now like deeper reading, for example, you can get this publication. Was published by Brigham Young University. It's Imam al-Ghazali's Incoherency of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa. It's in both Arabic and English. The translation is very good. It's a good translation. It's got both the Arabic and the English, page by page, so you can actually follow, line by line if you want to do that. It's a very good publication. And I don't have the Maqasid al-Falasifa in English. I don't think they ever published that. But if you do want the Arabic of it, I would recommend getting this version by Darul Minhaj. And that's what the cover looks like. This is Maqasid al-Falasifa. Darul Minhaj, they have their own team of like scholars who review the manuscripts, and they actually always publish like pictures of the different manuscripts that they have reviewed in order to what's known, it's called tahqiq in publishing. It's determining the veracity of the source material and not just nitpicking, which is what some other publishers do. Like Darussalam is like #1 culprit in my list for doing that. They always choose whatever works and suits their aqidah, and they are actually guilty of, though they will not admit it, but they are guilty of even doing certain omissions from certain texts or choosing a version of, because in those times, they didn't have a singular publication in control of everything. They had handwritten scripts, right? So sometimes like the scribe might miswrite a word, or if the manuscript is, let's say there like damage on it or something, he might have to guess what was written there. So that's why you have different manuscripts, surviving manuscripts, or different copies of those books. And so what Darul Minhaj does is they actually give you in there, they tell you, we have sourced this from these many manuscripts, and they'll give you in the footnotes, they'll tell you, this word in manuscript A, or Alif, they use the Arabic there. In Alif, it's this word, and in Ba, it's this one, and in Jim, it's that one, and in Dal, it's that one, like that. They'll tell you. So okay, because in context, the word changing can change the meaning also. So anyway, Darul Minhaj's publications are good. If you want the Arabic text and you can read Arabic, This is a good book, Maqasid al-Falasifa. And you can actually get Imam al-Ghazali's entire collection published in this format, same color cover with the different titles. If you want to go more deeper into Imam al-Ghazali's metaphysics, although I would not recommend it unless you have some grounding, because it is going to confuse you. His book, The Niche of Lights, Mishkat al-Anwar, is a good book. So this is also by Brigham University, and it's got both the English and the Arabic translations side by side. It's very good, actually. I use this to study his book, like the Mishkat al-Anwar. In fact, I still have some of my notes in here and highlights. I believe we did something on this during the psychology course. I think I read a passage from this because I can see here I left my sticky note in here.
We
Yeah.
read it with you.
I did, right? Yeah, I actually read from this book. Yeah, I haven't actually looked at this book for a long time because I got the original Arabic from Darul Minhaj, so I've been using the other one. But this is a good book to get the Niche of Lights. You have to be cautious with it because translation can also lose meaning, and you do need a teacher to help you understand what he means because he's speaking philosophically. And this is one thing that's very important when looking at the texts written by our classical scholars is you have to really distinguish the scholar's voice because our scholars were polymaths, meaning they had multiple disciplines, and in each discipline they spoke a different language. So when you look at Imam al-Ghazali's, for example, his al-Mustasfa, he's speaking as a jurist. Here, he's speaking as a metaphysician. In Maqasid, he's speaking as a philosopher. In Qistas al-Mustaqim, he's speaking as a logician. So, the framework, you have to sort of read it with a teacher who can explain, but you can still read. I mean, there's no prohibition. I'm not going to put a prohibition on anyone said don't read it. It's good to read. At least you get some exposure to the incredible work that our predecessors have done. So, invest in some of these books and keep them in your library. These are among the first books that I actually bought and kept them in my library. But for everyone, I will strongly recommend the Prolegomena. Please invest in this. I think you can find it on Amazon. I don't know how much it might be, depending on where you would be ordering from. But I mean, those who are in India, Pakistan, I think you can order it directly from Malaysia. Dar al-Risala Publishing is the publishing. Dar al-Risala. You can look up the cover is the same. You'll find it the same cover. Dar al-Risala Publishing. I think you can order it directly from Malaysia. It might be easier and cheaper than to tend to get it from like Amazon or one of these big corporations. But anyway, let's end for tonight. Maghrib time is going for us. So, subhanaka wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خيرا. الحمد لله. Thank you everyone for coming.